una teoría que se extendió en la prensa y es que pudo haber sido un accidente por una sedación de los niños. Ustedes han negado reiteradas veces que jamás a sus hijos para dormirles.
You know, I'm not even gonna answer that question, I'm afraid. All I'm gonna say is I'm Madeleine's mummy. I know she was taken from that apartment and she's out there. And I want her back. I mean, that is all. I mean, everything else, I'm sorry, is rubbish.
Praia da Luz was supposed to be a safe haven. A peaceful coastal town tucked along Portugal's Algarve, sun-drenched, slow-moving, a place where time seemed to stall in the best of ways. The kind of place where children laughed freely along cobbled paths, where tourists melted into local rhythms, and where the worst thing to happen in a summer might be a sunburn or a missed dinner reservation. But one night in May 2007 shattered that illusion forever. The moment Madeleine McCann was reported missing from apartment 5A of the Ocean Club Resort, the soul of Praia da Luz changed. It went from idyllic retreat to epicenter of a mystery that would span continents and decades. The narrow streets filled with flashing lights. Reporters flew in from around the world. Police tape, media vans, and whispers choked the air that had once smelled only of sea breeze and sunscreen. She was 3 years old. Blonde hair, big eyes, a playful smile that soon became iconic. A child like any other, until her name echoed in every corner of the globe, Madeleine McCann. Her disappearance wasn't just a headline. It was an eruption. One that gripped millions. Parents projected their fears onto the story. Reporters dissected every detail. Strangers wept for a girl they'd never met. The search wasn't just for a child. It became a search for meaning, for someone to blame, for answers in a case that offered almost none. But in the years since, as we followed the noise, as the investigations piled up and the theories spiraled out of control, one question has begun to haunt even the most seasoned observers. In the frantic race for answers, did we ask the wrong question? From the start, the story followed a singular trajectory. A child was taken. An abduction. A window of opportunity. A terrible crime that took place while her parents dined with friends just 50 meters away. It was clean, simple, horrifying, and perhaps too convenient. Every single investigative step was built on that assumption. The search zones, the interviews, the forensic analysis, the media coverage. Police departments in 2 countries operated under the belief that Madeleine was taken from her bed on the night of May 3, 2007. But what if she wasn't? What if May 3rd wasn't the night of the tragedy, but the night of the performance? What if the abduction narrative, the one we've heard for over a decade, was never the beginning, but the carefully constructed middle of a much darker story? Former Norwegian military police investigator Bernt Stellander thinks so. He didn't begin his inquiry with the same assumption the world did. He didn't ask, who took Madeleine? He asked, what if no one did? That question turns the entire story on its head. Because if there was no abduction, then there's no abductor. If May 3rd was not the night she vanished, then what exactly happened on May 2nd? And if the timeline was manipulated, even slightly, what else was orchestrated? There were inconsistencies even in the earliest statements. Conflicting witness accounts. Shifting details. Strange omissions. Why did so many members of the so-called Tapas 7 remember events almost too precisely? Why did timelines align so neatly in hindsight, despite the chaos of that night? In criminal investigations, precision under pressure often suggests either extreme clarity or rehearsed memory. And then there's the body language, the media appearances, the posture of calmness in interviews, the moments of phrasing that felt calculated, composed, as if navigating a narrative. Critics who questioned this were often labeled as cruel, insensitive, conspiratorial. But Stellander was a career investigator. He didn't rely on gut feelings or tabloid headlines. He relied on patterns, on behaviors, on what wasn't said as much as what was. And over time, he began to believe that the world had been watching a very carefully managed story, one that started after the real story had ended. He points to what he calls the emotional gaps. Why did Kate McCann begin jogging regularly after the disappearance, but return to one very specific, remote location time and again alone? Why did no forensic team ever fully excavate that site? Why were strange, ritualistic symbols found there? Flowers, shapes in the dirt, and formed from twigs. Why did 2 trained dogs alert to cadaver scent and human blood in both the holiday apartment and the McCann's rental vehicle? A car they didn't even hire until weeks after Madeleine disappeared. The official response? Cross-contamination. Critics said the dog alerts meant little without hard evidence. Stellander disagrees. Dogs don't lie, he says. People do. If there was cadaver scent in the car, then something was moved. Something that had been dead long enough to leave an olfactory signature. That doesn't happen by accident. And then there's the question of grief. Kate McCann visited Spot 1 over and over again. A quiet hillside. Out of sight. Out of reach. Stellander watched for weeks. He saw flowers laid with care. Symbols left in the dust. Acts of remembrance, he believed, not acts of hope. And always she came alone. Never with Gerry. That, to Stellander, was the most telling absence of all. He calls it emotional compartmentalization. A split between outward performance and inward truth. Kate grieving in private. Gerry maintaining the public face. A necessary balance or an unconscious admission? What if everything we've been told was tailored to fit a version of events that could not be undone? Because once the world accepts a timeline, it's nearly impossible to challenge it. The May 3rd story became canon. And yet, when you strip it down, the evidence of a break-in is weak. There were no signs of forced entry. No fingerprints. No conclusive DNA. Just the absence of a child, and a narrative that was quickly, almost immediately, adopted as fact. But what if that absence didn't begin on May 3rd? What if Madeleine died the night before? What if everything that followed, the checks, the calls, the press frenzy, the moment Gerry ran to reception shouting, "They've taken her," was part of a sequence already decided upon? A grim performance designed not to fool the world, but to align it. Because once the media is fed a headline, it takes on a life of its own. And in that storm of attention, quiet inconsistencies are often drowned out. But the silence speaks. The silence in Spot 1. The silence in unanswered forensic questions. The silence in timelines too clean to be true. So the question remains, was Praia da Luz the scene of a kidnapping? Or was it the setting of something much harder to accept? Because if Madeleine died on May 2nd, and the panic on May 3rd was staged, then what the world witnessed wasn't the aftermath of a crime. It was the creation of a cover story. And in that light, everything changes. Not because it's proven, not because it's certain, but because it's possible. And in this case, that possibility is the weight we cannot shake. Kate McCann calls the police. They've taken her. 3 words that detonated across headlines, borders, and dinner tables. 3 words that shaped the entire global narrative before anyone asked a single question. But what if those words weren't a spontaneous cry for help? What if they were something else entirely, intentional, chosen, and rehearsed? Because here's what no one ever asks. Taken by whom? Taken when? And most importantly, was anyone even taken at all? There was no forced entry. No screams. No shattered glass. No frantic sounds of struggle. No torn clothing. No signs that a predator had crept in from the night and snatched a child from her bed. Just the words, "They've taken her," spoken with conviction. To former military police investigator Bernd Stellander, this wasn't the start of a crime. It was the start of a script. He believes May 3rd wasn't the night Madeleine vanished. It was the night the performance began. And that phrase? It wasn't panic, it was direction. A message embedded in 3 perfectly chosen words. The tragedy, he believes, didn't happen in front of the world. It happened in silence. The kind of silence that lives behind closed doors. The kind that leaves no evidence, just regret. And when something irreparable happens in private, the only way to survive it is to create a new truth. One that fits the public eye. One the world can believe in. Because a story needs villains. A story needs heroes. And most of all, a story needs victims. They've taken her, gave the world all 3. But the evidence, the real evidence, whispers a different tale. The dogs alerted to cadaver scent in places they never should have. The rental car, the closet, the child's toy. The smell of death doesn't lie. Blood doesn't relocate itself. Time doesn't skip. And grief doesn't hide forever. Yet in the days following Madeleine's disappearance, Kate jogged every morning. Not to escape the press. Not to search the streets. But to return to a secluded hillside, again and again. Alone. That spot, later dubbed Spot 1, became a silent monument to something unspoken. Flowers arranged in patterns. Formed out of twigs. Heart-shaped symbols etched into dirt. Not random. Not coincidence. Ritual. Stellander didn't intervene. He watched. Documented. For years. And through rain, heat, and silence, the site changed, but it never disappeared. Kate returned to it, not as a hopeful mother, but as someone mourning. Someone remembering. Someone unable to let go. Meanwhile, Gerry McCann stayed away. Publicly assertive. Rational. Focused on press statements, legal options, and controlling the message. But never there. Never beside her at Spot 1. Never kneeling in the dirt. Never part of the ritual. And to Stellander, that's not just a choice. It's a fracture. He calls it emotional compartmentalization. A coping mechanism where trauma is buried, sealed off, denied. Not the behavior of a grieving father, but of someone who needs to keep the narrative intact. Because if you mourn in public, the truth might leak through the cracks. And if the truth is too dangerous, too final, then silence becomes survival. Stellander's theory doesn't end with suspicion. It builds a new timeline. One that begins on May 2nd, the night before the world thinks Madeleine vanished. He believes she died that night. Accidentally. Unexpectedly. And everything that followed, the dinner, the checks, the alarm on May 3rd, was a rehearsal. Not for the police. For the world. Because if the real night of tragedy was May 2nd, then May 3rd becomes a lie. A carefully staged performance to align the neighbors, the Tapas 7, the resort staff, and the media. Every player cued. Every line rehearsed. Every emotion framed to support the only version of events the world was allowed to see. And if that's true, then what else was staged? The press frenzy? The trips to the Vatican? The interviews? The photo shoots? The smiles? The tears? Or was it all part of a single, desperate mission? To protect the lie? Because if Madeleine died on May 2nd, and her body was moved in the days or weeks that followed, then the cadaver scent in the rental car isn't speculation. It's evidence. Final. Unmistakable. And those rituals at Spot 1? They're not abstract symbols of maternal hope. They are mourning. Personal. Intimate. Kate McCann wasn't just searching. She was remembering. She was returning to the place where a secret was kept alive. Not the secret of what happened, but the secret of when it happened. So why hasn't that hill been searched? Why hasn't it been excavated? Why has it been allowed to fade into overgrowth and dust, instead of studied for clues? To Stellander, the answer is simple, because no one wants to look. Because finding something there would break the story that has kept the world comfortable. The story of abduction. The story of innocence. Because if no one took Madeleine, then everything collapses. The donations. The sympathy. The campaigns. The documentaries. The moral clarity. It all dissolves into something darker. A cover-up. A domestic tragedy hidden behind press conferences and international search teams. A wound disguised as a mystery. And that leads us back to the question no one wants to ask. What if no one took her? What if the truth was simpler and more devastating? What if the real story was never about abduction, but about the fear of what the truth would cost? Because in that version of events, there's no monster in the dark. There's no evil stranger. There's no escape. Just a moment of irreversible consequence, and the unbearable weight of what came next. And if Stellander is right, then that weight has been carried in silence for nearly 2 decades. But if he's wrong, if everything he suggests is misguided, speculative, even cruel, then we have wrongly condemned a family already destroyed by grief. That is the razor's edge this case has always walked. And while the official investigation now points to Christian Bruckner, a convicted sex offender who lived nearby, there is no conviction. No physical evidence. No charges. No body. Just another shadow. Bernd Stellander doesn't offer certainty, only doubt. And in cases like this, doubt doesn't fade, it lingers. It festers. It grows. Because Madeleine McCann was 3 years old. Her smile captured the world. Her story became legend. Her face became a symbol of lost innocence. But her fate remains unknown. And whether you believe Stellander or reject him entirely, one question still burns in the background. If the timeline was a performance, then what truth was buried beneath it? And if someone out there knows the real story, this is your moment to speak. Bernd Stellander, former military police investigator, didn't begin by looking at suspects. He didn't fixate on who seemed emotional or who didn't cry enough in front of cameras. He didn't read into body language or press conferences or sympathy. He focused on something far more reliable, more mechanical. He focused on time. Because time, he believed, doesn't lie. Unlike people. And the first thing that caught his attention wasn't a person at all. It was a pattern. The timeline of May 3, 2007, as described by every member of the Tapas group, including Kate and Gerry McCann, seemed oddly consistent. Too consistent. Their statements aligned like synchronized watches. Everyone seemed to know exactly when they did things, where they were, who checked on which child, what was seen, what wasn't. To Stellander, this wasn't a sign of truth, it was a sign of planning. Because in real emergencies, people don't behave like that. They panic. They forget. They contradict one another. Their memories fracture under the weight of trauma. But the McCann timeline didn't fracture. It stood solid, linear, unbroken. He reread the statements again and again. The dinner, the wine, the checks on the children at regular intervals. Each member of the group following the same story, almost as if it had been written out in advance. He began to think of it not as a sequence of events, but as a performance. There were no mistakes in that timeline. No confusion. No overlapping accounts. Just clean, uninterrupted logic. And that, Stellander believed, was deeply unnatural. Real life isn't like that. Real life is messy. And so, he asked the question no one else had dared to ask in the years following Madeleine's disappearance. What if the events of May 3rd weren't real? What if they were scripted? What if the true tragedy didn't happen on May 3rd at all, but the night before? He began working backwards, looking not for who could have abducted Madeleine, but whether there had ever been an abduction at all. If the crime scene was staged, the timeline polished, and the alibis rehearsed, then perhaps the real story had already happened. Off stage. The panic of May 3rd, the shouting, the running, the international headlines, all part of a second act designed to distract from the first. Because if Madeleine had died on May 2nd, if something had happened that night that no one outside the group witnessed, then everything that followed would be about control. Control of information. Control of perception. Control of time itself. And so Stellander returned to the timeline. Not to verify it, but to dismantle it. Piece by piece. Moment by moment. Looking not for clarity, but for cracks. Because he believed that buried beneath the perfection of that night was something far messier. Something no one wanted the world to see. And that's where his investigation truly began. Why did Kate McCann, amid pages of grief, confusion, and public outcry, refer to May 2nd as the night of all nights? Why, in a case built entirely around the events of May 3rd, would the previous night be marked so vividly in her memory? For Bernd Stellander, that single line wasn't poetic. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't a metaphor for worry or anticipation. It was the crack in the mask. To Stellander, that phrase is not just suspicious, it's central. In his view, it points to a catastrophic shift in the emotional landscape of that family. Something so profound, so final, that the memory of it couldn't help but bleed into her words. Madeleine, he believes, didn't vanish on May 3rd. She died on May 2nd. Quietly. Secretly. Tragically. Stellander's theory doesn't begin with strangers in the night or suspicious vans. It starts with something more familiar, more human, a mistake, a terrible moment, and then the machinery of panic, the calculations, the silence. According to him, what followed was not the horror of an abduction, but the execution of a strategy, a plan, a timeline that had to be built, carefully, publicly, and quickly. He believes May 3rd was chosen because it allowed for plausible alibis, aligned better with tourist routines, and gave time. Time to clean, time to move, time to decide. The calls to the Tapas friends, the dinner arrangements, the apartment checks, the infamous window. In his eyes, every detail was curated. And if he's right, if the abduction never happened, then the line between witness and actor becomes uncomfortably thin. But let's return to that phrase, the night of all nights. What was so significant about May 2nd that Kate McCann would immortalize it in her own words? Why describe it that way? If nothing happened, why would that night be so deeply etched into her emotional memory? Stellander isn't a novelist. He's a former investigator trained to look past what's said and examine what's revealed. He believes this line isn't just an emotional slip, it's evidence. A breadcrumb. A timestamp not of loss, but of impact. In his working timeline, the tragedy unfolded sometime on the evening of May 2nd. Perhaps while the children were sleeping. Perhaps during a moment of chaos. Perhaps in an accident. But in any case, not the following night. This is where Stellander's logic sharpens. If Madeleine died on May 2nd, then May 3rd had to be orchestrated. Not just for the press. Not just for the public. But for law enforcement. For neighbors. For everyone. A single, unified moment of panic that could not be questioned. A scripted version of reality where grief and shock would look authentic because, in part, they were. But grief and guilt don't behave the same way. And to a trained observer, they move differently. They linger. They repeat. And so Stellander returned to that phrase again and again. What made it the night of all nights? Why would a mother, months after her daughter's alleged abduction, attach that kind of emotional weight to the night before? He reviewed interviews. He cross-referenced timelines. He studied language patterns. And he always came back to this. If you remove the assumption of an abduction, the entire puzzle reshapes itself. Then, suddenly, the inconsistencies make sense. The cadaver sent in a rental car weeks later? Explained by a body that was moved. The emotional distance of a father? Reframed as suppression. The repeated solitary visits to a hillside known only to the mother? Viewed no longer as coping but as mourning. Everything hinges on that one possibility. That the night the world was told to care about, May 3rd, was a decoy. And the real story, the real loss, the real truth, happened silently on the night before. The night of all nights. 2 dogs. Specially trained. One to detect the unmistakable scent of human decomposition, cadaver scent. The other, trained to locate even trace amounts of human blood. They were brought in after traditional searches turned up nothing. After media coverage had turned the investigation into a spectacle. But these dogs didn't care about headlines or timelines. They responded only to one thing, the unmistakable chemical markers of death. Inside apartment 5A, the very place where the McCanns stayed, both dogs reacted. Not just a mild interest. Not curiosity. But direct, trained signals. The cadaver dog barked beside the wardrobe in the parents' bedroom. He sat rigid by the curtain near the patio door. He indicated behind the sofa. To him, something had once died there. And the blood dog? He reacted too, on that same floor near the sofa, suggesting bodily fluids had once pooled or splattered there. Not visible to the naked eye. But still present. That alone would raise questions. But what happened next deep in the mystery? A Renault Scenic. Rented by the McCanns 24 days after Madeleine's reported disappearance. A car they used to move between locations. One they shared with others. The dogs were brought to that car, along with several others. No identifiers. No cues. Both dogs reacted, again, to that one specific vehicle. The cadaver dog gave a clear alert to the driver's side trunk area. The blood dog confirmed traces on the key fob and near the wheel arch. Critics argue contamination. A stray scent. Some trace object that made its way into the car. But those who work with these dogs, who understand the science behind their noses, insist the scent of human decomposition is specific. It's not transferable in casual contact. It clings to the place of death, to the body, to the air molecules around it. It's not the scent of rot or garbage. It's the unique chemical signature of a decaying human body. Eddie and Keela, those were the dogs' names, had been used in dozens of prior investigations. From homicide scenes to missing persons. Their accuracy, documented. Their instincts, trusted by law enforcement around the world. They didn't make arrests. They didn't draw conclusions. But they pointed. They pointed to the McCann's apartment. And they pointed to the McCann's rental car. To Stellander, and to many silent skeptics, that was the moment everything changed. Because while people can lie, while memories can be shaped, while timelines can be altered, dogs have no motive. They have no bias. They do not read news articles or take sides. They only detect what is, or once was, real. And what they detected was death. Amaral, the original lead investigator, later wrote in his book The Truth of the Lie that from early in the investigation, he believed Madeleine McCann had died inside that apartment. Not kidnapped. Not taken through a broken shutter. But dead, before the search even began. For Amaral, it wasn't just a theory born out of frustration. It was a conclusion rooted in what he described as the silent evidence. Things that didn't speak but still revealed everything. There were no signs of forced entry. No damage to the window or shutter. No neighbors heard screaming. No DNA or fingerprints pointing to an intruder. Instead, there were scent particles, alerted to by the dogs. There was trace blood found behind the sofa. There were inconsistencies in statements, subtle changes in timelines, emotional cues that didn't fit. None of it conclusive on its own. But layered together, it formed a narrative Amaral believed was deliberately buried beneath media pressure and political interference. He noted that the dogs, Eddie and Keela, were deployed late, months after the event, but still signaled cadaver scent inside the apartment and in the car. He documented how Gerry McCann refused to answer 48 police questions. He watched Kate's behavior change under pressure, especially when asked directly whether she had sedated her children that night. Amaral described these reactions as emotionally detached, rehearsed even, and lacking the raw panic expected from innocent parents who had just lost a child to a stranger. More importantly, Amaral believed the psychology of grief, the absence of it in public statements, the overemphasis on abduction as the only possibility, was telling. He wrote that experienced investigators are trained to look for emotional dissonance, those subtle gaps between what someone says and what their body unconsciously reveals. To him, those gaps were everywhere. He believed the media frenzy had hijacked the investigation, turning it into a political storm rather than a criminal inquiry. Foreign diplomats were involved. The British government sent representatives. Suddenly, a missing child case became an international event, too big to fail. The idea that something had gone wrong internally, that Madeleine had died accidentally and her body hidden in panic, was too disturbing, too unthinkable to broadcast. And so, Amaral believed a lie was accepted as truth and repeated until it became the official story. Even after being removed from the case, even after legal battles and public backlash, Amaral never retracted his theory. He stood by it, claiming the timeline was flawed, the evidence manipulated, and that a critical window of investigation was lost in the first 48 hours due to media pressure and political shielding. For him, the cadaver scent wasn't just a clue. It was the voice of the victim, a forensic echo of a truth no one wanted to hear. "They've taken her." 3 words that ricocheted across the globe, ricocheting from a quiet holiday apartment in Praia da Luz to newspaper headlines, breaking news tickers, and candlelight vigils around the world. But for former Norwegian military police investigator Bernt Stellander, those 3 words weren't the desperate cry of a mother discovering her child gone. They were something else entirely. A line. A trigger. A red flag. To the public, it sounded urgent, heartbroken, spontaneous. But Stellander, trained to dissect both behavior and language, heard something else in that phrase: deliberate construction. because in his experience, people in moments of real panic don't use specific language like, "they've taken her." They use disjointed phrases. "She's gone." "Where is she?" "Help." Raw emotion rarely speaks in full sentences. But this sentence wasn't raw. It was refined. Stellander points out that the word "they" implies certainty, certainty that another party was responsible, and that the event was abduction. Yet at the moment Kate McCann reportedly made that statement, no doors were broken, no windows shattered, no screams heard. Nothing suggested an intruder had come or gone. There was no visible chaos, no signs of struggle, no signs of forced entry. And yet, they had taken her? This choice of words, Stellander argues, did something powerful. It created an immediate direction for everyone involved: the police, the public, and the press. It framed the narrative. It pointed suspicion outward, far away from apartment 5A and the people inside it. It turned a private tragedy into a public mystery with a single pronoun. But here's the darker implication. What if "they've taken her" was not a spontaneous outburst? What if it had been rehearsed, practiced in the mirror or whispered in the dark the night before, after something terrible had already happened? That would mean that the moment Kate McCann said those words, she wasn't announcing a crime, she was launching a cover story. If Madeleine had died the night before, as Stellander theorizes, then those 3 words became the foundation of an alternate reality. A replacement story. A necessary illusion to protect the people who remained, and to redirect the fury of the world away from the truth. And then there's the psychological effect. Language shapes memory. When Kate said, "they've taken her," she didn't just inform the police, she informed herself. Repeating a story enough times can convince even the storyteller. That's how trauma and guilt can fracture. How narratives form around denial. How lies become belief. Critics argue this is pure speculation. That in moments of trauma, people say strange things. That "they've taken her" was just a phrase, no more calculated than a scream in the night. But Stellander stands firm. Words, especially the first ones spoken in crisis, matter deeply. They often reveal more than they conceal. And in this case, he believes those words concealed the most devastating truth of all, that no one took Madeleine McCann. That something happened long before that call was made. And that the story the world was told began with a script, not a scream. Experts analyzing the McCanns' early interviews and statements uncovered something peculiar, something that kept cropping up in every retelling of that night. The unmistakable repetition of passive language, vague phrasing, and a conspicuous lack of direct responsibility. Phrases like "she's gone," "she was taken," and "it all happened so fast" echoed throughout their testimonies, but almost never did anyone clarify who saw what, who did what, or who exactly was responsible. For law enforcement and behavioral analysts, this isn't just a linguistic curiosity, it's a psychological flag. And then came the most striking detail, the now infamous phrase uttered by Kate McCann, "they've taken her." Just 3 words. But they became the emotional backbone of a global manhunt, the first domino in a cascade of headlines, police alerts, and international coverage. To the public, it was a mother's desperate cry. But to Bernd Stellander, it was something else entirely. He found the phrase too clean, too deliberate, too conveniently crafted. It wasn't screamed in a raw moment of horror or whispered in confusion. It was declared, loudly, within earshot of others. It set the tone immediately, anchoring the narrative around abduction before any forensic investigation had taken place. Who's they? Why did Kate jump to the conclusion of kidnapping instead of assuming Madeleine had wandered off, fallen, or hidden somewhere nearby? Stellander began to see this not as a spontaneous reaction, but as a rehearsed performance. And what disturbed him even more was how quickly and consistently everyone around the McCanns adopted the same language. Their holiday friends, the so-called Tapas 7, echoed the same phrases in their own interviews. They described checking on their children in a checking system that conveniently supported the idea of a window of opportunity for an abductor. Their timelines, though allegedly drawn from memory during a crisis, seemed remarkably synchronized. Witnesses repeated the same time estimates, the same expressions, the same assumptions. In Stellander's experience, that's not how trauma works. Real trauma fractures memory. It creates contradiction. Genuine panic leads to inconsistencies, details get blurred, stories shift, time loses meaning. But in this case, Stellander noticed something else: unity, agreement, consistency. And that, to him, was unnatural. He wasn't suggesting everyone in the group was involved in something sinister. But he believed it was possible, perhaps even likely, that they were all told what to say. Not necessarily under threat, but out of a shared commitment to protect someone, or to hide something. Maybe a terrible accident, maybe something worse. The phrase, "they've taken her," became more than just a sentence. It became the foundation of an international assumption. It shifted public opinion, influenced law enforcement direction, and shaped media narratives. No one stopped to question whether those 3 words were based on fact, or if they were the first line in a carefully designed script meant to control the fallout from a night gone terribly wrong. Stellander wasn't alone in his concerns. Other investigators, linguists, and forensic psychologists have raised similar questions. Why was the immediate assumption abduction? Why not an accident? Why not wandering off? And why did everyone involved seem to share the same version of events, almost word for word? To Stellander, the answer lies not just in what was said, but in how it was said, when it was said, and why it was said so quickly. In a real abduction, panic sounds like chaos. In this case, it sounded like theater. Public grief is expected. But what happens when the mind suppresses guilt? Some behavior resembled conditioned repetition, suggesting extreme stress or internalized fear. Stellander observed the body language, the scripted cadence of speech, the oddly mechanical delivery during interviews. To him, these weren't just signs of grief, they were signs of compartmentalization. The McCanns, especially Gerry, often appeared disconnected at key emotional moments. Instead of raw sorrow, there was composure. Instead of tremors in the voice, there were polished phrases, almost rehearsed. He wasn't alone in noticing it. Behavioral analysts across Europe quietly flagged inconsistencies, not in facts, but in effect. The discrepancy between what was being said and how it was being said. When a grieving parent recalls their missing child, the mind typically floods with emotional triggers, memories, facial expressions, specific quirks. But when asked about Madeleine's favorite toys, her laughter, or the last thing she said, the responses from the parents were frequently vague or deflective. In some cases, they redirected the conversation back to the abduction narrative, as if deviating from it was dangerous. To Stellander, this reinforced his belief that something had happened that night requiring intense psychological defense. He theorized that the trauma had been processed not as loss, but as responsibility. The brain, in self-preservation, had built a firewall of belief. She was taken. She was taken. She was taken. Say it enough, repeat it enough, and eventually, it becomes real. Not just to the world, but to yourself. And that's what made the public appearances even more haunting. The calm demeanor, the uniform clothing, the constant reminders that they were doing everything we can. It was PR, not parenting. Optics, not anguish. In Stellander's notes, he wrote, "This isn't just trauma. It's trauma buried under narrative control." At vigils and press conferences, Kate often appeared frozen, eyes cast down, hands clenched tightly. Gerry, meanwhile, would speak to cameras with a diplomatic tone, often switching from emotion to policy, from sorrow to strategy, within seconds. Stellander saw this not as proof of innocence or guilt, but as psychological evidence of something suppressed. Because grief is chaotic. It spills. It forgets how to be polite. It breaks down mid-sentence. But theirs didn't. Theirs held form, held shape. It repeated itself. And that repetition, to Stellander, wasn't just habit, it was a survival mechanism. Inconsistent emotions. Robotic answers. A desperate need to control the story. Could the McCanns have experienced a traumatic accident and simply couldn't face the truth? That single question haunts every quiet corner of Bernd Stellander's theory. Not because it accuses with certainty, but because it dares to look where others have chosen not to. The case, he says, is not just about a missing child. It's about how human beings respond when reality becomes unbearable. When a single, irreversible moment spirals into a chain of consequences too massive to undo. He doesn't see monsters. He sees people trapped in a lie that outgrew them. When he looks at Kate McCann, he doesn't just see a grieving mother. He sees someone in the grip of a carefully curated narrative. Her emotional expression was tightly controlled. Her interviews were peppered with prepared language, phrases repeated word for word, as if memorized. No raw slips of sorrow. No visible confusion. Just clarity. Too much of it. And Stellander believes clarity in trauma can sometimes be a red flag. Because when a person is truly shattered, the pieces don't line up so neatly. And Gerry? His presentation was even more guarded. Measured. Composed. He projected leadership, resolve. But what was missing, Stellander says, was vulnerability. The kind you can't fake or manufacture. It's the trembling hand. The eyes that won't stop scanning the floor. The voice that catches without warning. In Gerry, none of that surfaced. What did appear, again and again, was a quiet insistence on control. Of the facts, of the framing, of the emotions themselves. Then there's the language. From the very first moment, words were chosen with almost surgical care. They've taken her. Not, she's gone. Not, help me. But, they, as if the perpetrators were known. Identified. Plural. It's a framing device, Stellander says, something that shapes the listener's perception before they've had time to question. And it worked. From the moment Kate made that statement, the media, police, and the public locked into a single belief. This was a kidnapping. A foreign invader had come in the night, snatched a child from her bed, and vanished. But Stellander argues that belief wasn't the result of evidence. It was the result of storytelling. The power of a single, well-placed sentence to shape a global narrative. He isn't alone in this observation. Forensic linguists and behavioral analysts have long noted how early statements in a crisis often reveal more than later ones. They're raw, less filtered. In those first seconds, people don't usually lie unless they've rehearsed. And they've taken her, to Stellander, too polished, too definitive, as if it had been said before, practiced until it sounded like panic, while avoiding its chaos. He points to the moments immediately after the alarm was raised. The calls to friends. The rush to update the media. The precise naming of Madeleine's eye defect. A coloboma broadcasted not as a heartbreaking detail, but as a marketing tool. It was on posters, flyers, even wristbands. Find Madeleine, the campaign said. But to Stellander, it didn't feel like a search. It felt like a brand rollout. Coordinated. Unnaturally so. And then came the timelines, multiple versions of them. Each slightly different. Each trying to explain who saw what, when. But inconsistencies appeared. Witnesses contradicted each other. Statements shifted. Some people couldn't even remember if they checked the room at the time they claimed. Others swore they saw the shutters forced open, something the police later said showed no signs of tampering. For Stellander, this wasn't just human error. It was the beginning of a manufactured timeline unraveling under its own weight. The McCanns insisted they were innocent, that they had no reason to harm their child, that they were victims of a bungled investigation and a biased media. And in many ways, they were right, about the media, at least. The frenzy was vicious. Tabloids speculated. Bloggers theorized. People painted them as villains with little more than gut instinct and tabloid rage. But Stellander wasn't interested in hate. He was interested in patterns. And in the McCann case, the pattern was control. Control of the narrative. Control of public emotion. Control of the physical evidence, even refusing to answer certain police questions or return to Portugal for a reconstruction. That decision, he says, raised another question. If your daughter is missing, and you believe she's alive, why wouldn't you do everything, absolutely everything, to help? The reconstruction was key. It was meant to clarify the timeline, identify inconsistencies, and possibly trigger new memories. But the McCanns and their friends, the so-called Tapas 7, refused to participate. Too painful, they said. too traumatizing. Yet Stellander couldn't help but wonder, was it pain they were avoiding, or exposure? He isn't a conspiracy theorist. He doesn't claim to have solved the case. What he offers is a perspective, the idea that truth, in its purest form, often hides in silence. In what's not said, in what's too tidy, too coordinated, too convenient. He sees the case not as a murder mystery, but as a psychological pressure cooker. A moment of unimaginable horror followed by a desperate attempt to hold life together. Maybe it was an accident, a fall, a misjudged dose of sedative, a moment of neglect that turned fatal. And maybe, just maybe, that moment birthed a cover story so large, so convincing, that even those telling it began to believe it. And if that's true, Stellander warns, then justice will never come through legal channels. There's no body, no confession, just whispers, glances, fragments. It's not enough for courtrooms, but it might be enough for understanding, because sometimes the truth isn't hidden in darkness. It's buried beneath layers of fear, love, and shame. And in the McCann case, he suspects the truth was never about a stranger in the night. It was about a family shattered by tragedy and a world too afraid to ask the real question. What if the abduction never happened at all? When the original Portuguese team was pushed aside, British agencies stepped in. But what followed didn't look like a standard international cooperation. It looked like a strategic reset. The narrative changed. The tone shifted. Suddenly, the focus wasn't on forensic evidence or conflicting witness accounts. It was on restoring the McCann's public image. Police efforts turned media-centric. Press conferences became more polished. Photos of Madeleine appeared everywhere, her face on buses, billboards, global campaigns. Scotland Yard opened Operation Grange, but even its objective seemed unclear. Was it to find the abductor, or to reframe the story for a world that was starting to ask uncomfortable questions? Stellander watched closely. He noted how evidence trails were deprioritized while media control intensified. Interviews were steered. Critics were silenced. And any suggestion that the McCanns might know more than they admitted was treated as taboo, even dangerous. Witnesses who offered alternate theories found themselves ignored or publicly discredited. To Stellander, this wasn't just about finding a child anymore. It was about salvaging trust. In the parents, in the system, in the idea that things like this only happen because of monsters, not mistakes. So, was it a criminal investigation, or a PR recovery mission disguised as one? Stellander believes the answer lies in who benefited, and what truths were quietly buried along the way. Instead of leading to arrests, renewed forensic investigation, or hard criminal charges, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann gradually morphed into something else, something quieter, and perhaps more revealing. It became a battle not over what happened, but over who had the right to say what might have happened. That shift, says Bernd Stellander, is where the real story hides. When the original Portuguese investigative team was removed from the case, particularly after Goncalo Amaral was sidelined, the British police took over. But instead of expanding the search based on the Portuguese findings, they redirected it entirely. Suddenly, theories that once focused on forensic alerts, behavioral inconsistencies, and timeline gaps were deemed unhelpful, even dangerous. Amaral wasn't just removed from the investigation, he became its scapegoat. But Amaral didn't back down. In 2008, he published a book, A Verdade de Mentira, The Truth of the Lie. In it, he laid out what he believed had really happened, that Madeleine died in the apartment on May 2nd, and that her death was covered up in a coordinated effort. His theory wasn't just rooted in suspicion. It was backed by months of investigative work, expert canine searches, apartment forensics, and the behavioral patterns of key individuals. The book sent shockwaves through Europe, and the McCanns responded swiftly, filing a defamation lawsuit that would drag on for nearly a decade. But here's the twist. They didn't sue Amaral for misconduct during the investigation. They didn't accuse him of planting evidence or abusing his authority. They sued him for publishing a theory, a narrative that contradicted theirs. The courtroom, once a venue for truth-seeking in criminal justice, became a battleground for public perception. The civil case against Amaral was not about proving what happened to Madeleine. It was about defending an image, an identity, a story. And for a while, the McCanns won. A lower court sided with them, ordering Amaral to pay damages and banning further distribution of his book. But in 2015, the Portuguese Supreme Court overturned that decision. Amaral had not defamed the McCanns. The court ruled he had exercised his legal right to express his interpretation of the case, grounded in evidence he personally investigated. That ruling did not solve the mystery of Madeleine's disappearance. But it did something else. It opened a door. A civil court had just acknowledged that an alternate version of events, one not rooted in abduction, was legitimate enough to be published, debated, and publicly discussed. For Bernd Stellander, this was a watershed moment. Because what the criminal justice system wouldn't, or couldn't, explore due to political pressure, international scrutiny, or media influence, the civil process was forced to confront. Stellander believes that's no accident. In fact, he sees it as a form of controlled containment. The truth can exist, but only in spaces where it doesn't threaten prosecutions, reputations, or diplomatic ties. And that's the problem. What happens when the pursuit of justice is quietly replaced by the management of public narrative? When police reports are rewritten to protect optics? When a grieving family's right to privacy crosses into the territory of immunity from suspicion? These are uncomfortable questions. But they're questions Stellander insists on asking, not because he's convinced of guilt, but because the refusal to ask them is even more dangerous. He doesn't see Amaral's theory as perfect. He acknowledges its gaps. But he sees its silencing, its deliberate suppression, as a symptom of something larger. Something insidious. A fear, not of finding a suspect, but of discovering a tragedy too close to home. One that didn't require a stranger. One that didn't require a break-in, a chase, or a snatch and run. Just a moment, a mistake, a panic, and a choice that spiraled into a lie too big to control. And so, while the world debated Christian Bruckner, scanned German properties, and rehashed old footage of Praia da Luz, the only court that came close to acknowledging a different reality wasn't a criminal one. It was civil, quiet, almost hidden in plain sight. For Stellander, that says everything. Every time someone asked the wrong question, they were sued, silenced, or discredited. But silence is its own kind of answer. And in the McCann case, that silence became an ecosystem, a protective shell wrapped tightly around a narrative too delicate to challenge openly. Journalists who veered too close to alternative timelines were pulled from assignments. Police officers who questioned inconsistencies were reassigned. Researchers, authors, and even fellow parents who dared to suggest another possibility found themselves under fire, not for lying, but for asking the one thing power fears most. What if the official version isn't true? The system didn't refute them with facts. It punished them with pressure. Stellander calls it institutional gaslighting. A process by which legitimate inquiry is reframed as conspiracy, dissent is painted as cruelty, and truth is blurred until it's no longer distinguishable from damage control. He points to a timeline of legal threats, libel suits, and strategic media takedowns. Each one, he says, didn't just silence a voice. It sent a message: this story is closed. Don't touch it. But closed stories don't generate decades of public obsession. They don't inspire amateur sleuths, whistleblowers, or forensic experts to keep digging long after the press has moved on. They don't raise more questions the longer they sit still. And yet, this one did. Because deep down, the world sensed something was unfinished. The law didn't deliver justice. It delivered a ceasefire. A fragile, temporary calm negotiated not in courtrooms, but in boardrooms, in embassy halls, and behind the closed doors of institutions more concerned with stability than truth. It was a truce born not of clarity, but of exhaustion. A way to stop the bleeding without treating the wound. And in the quiet that followed, the questions never stopped echoing. Why were investigators forbidden from pursuing certain leads? Why were Portuguese officials shut out of the final stages? Why did British intelligence review a case that was supposedly about child abduction? Why was the scent of death detected, but never explained? Why did the timeline shift? Why did reports vanish? Why did so many people, on both sides of the investigation, walk away saying we weren't allowed to do our jobs? In most criminal cases, silence means uncertainty. But in this case, silence became the loudest signal of all. Not because the truth wasn't found, but because someone decided it shouldn't be spoken. And Stellander believes that's the real legacy of this case. Not just a missing child, but a blueprint for how truth dies in plain sight. Not with denial, but with delays. Not with facts, but with fear. Not with a verdict, but with a silence so deep, even justice lost its voice. So when the cameras turned off, when the lawsuits were settled, and when the world moved on, the questions remained. Lingering in the spaces where facts used to be. Waiting. Unanswered. Unwelcome. But never forgotten. Because real silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the burial of truth. And someday, when the silence lifts, we may finally understand why this case refused to rest. Not because of what was known, but because of what was kept from us. We began with a question. What if Madeleine McCann wasn't abducted? What if that story, the one that launched 1,000 headlines and mobilized nations, wasn't rooted in a stranger's evil, but in something closer, something quieter? What if that story was born out of panic and continued out of fear? It's not the version we were told. It's not the version the press repeated. But it's the version that some investigators, forensic analysts, and behavioral experts quietly considered behind the scenes. A version that doesn't start with an open window, but with a tragic accident. A child sedated to help her sleep through another unsupervised evening. A dose too strong. A moment of stillness mistaken for rest, until it was too late. And in that moment, that silence, a terrible decision was made. Not out of malice. Not out of evil, but out of sheer human desperation. Because when faced with the truth, the consequences were unthinkable. A mother, a father, both respected professionals, realized they would not just lose a child, but everything: careers, reputations, their twins, their freedom. And so, panic gave birth to a story. An abduction. An open window. A stranger who vanished into the night. From that moment on, everything became about preserving that version, about keeping the lie alive. Not just to protect themselves, but to protect their world, their image, their safety. And so began the loudest case of a generation. A media blitz. A global manhunt. A storm of fundraising, politics, lawsuits, and headlines. And yet, beneath it all, a single tragic truth may have been buried, that a little girl died in her holiday apartment on May 2nd, and every moment after that was damage control. The story became too big to undo. The lie, too painful to reverse. And so it was sustained. Not by facts, but by fear. Not by justice, but by silence. Stellander's theory doesn't accuse. It grieves. It looks past the spectacle and asks what kind of system we've built, where the truth can be so dangerous, it must be erased. Where a child's death becomes a political incident. Where the silence around her becomes louder than her life. This theory won't be accepted by everyone, but it must be asked, because until we dare to question the beginning, we may never understand why this case never found an end. Sometimes the greatest cover-ups don't require a villain. There's no need for a masked kidnapper, a shadowy network, or a faceless predator lurking in the dark. Sometimes, all it takes is a moment. One irreversible mistake. And people who are too human, too afraid, to face what that mistake might mean. A sedative given to help a child sleep. A parent thinking it was harmless. A miscalculation. A breath not taken. And then the silence. Deafening. Final. What happens next doesn't come from evil. It comes from terror. From love twisted by fear. From a mother and father staring into the abyss of their own destruction and choosing survival over confession. In that moment, honesty could mean handcuffs, headlines, the judgment of the world. So instead, they reached for a story. Not a perfect one, not even a believable one, but one that bought time, one that shifted blame, one that, with enough money, power, and influence, could grow legs and run. And it did. The abduction narrative became a shield, one that protected not just the McCanns, but the institutions around them. Politicians, diplomats, media giants, Everyone who had a stake in making sure the public never looked behind the curtain. This is a dark hypothesis. It's painful. It challenges everything we want to believe about innocence, about justice, about family. But in silence, darkness often grows. Because when the truth becomes too dangerous to say, it hides. It festers in sealed files, redacted reports, and media briefings that end with no further questions. It grows in the cracks between public sympathy and private suspicion. It thrives in the tension between what we're told and what we feel is missing. And unless we ask the unthinkable, unless we push past the carefully constructed narrative and truly look, at the evidence, the behavior, the silence, we'll never know what really happened that night. We'll never know if Madeleine McCann was taken by a stranger, or by a lie too heavy to confess.